Independence, Missouri. What do presidents do at this time? He was kind of one of the first ones to do this. What do presidents do after they retire? They write their memoirs, and they usually work on a presidential library. Okay? And it usually opens up where? In their hometown. So after his retirement, Truman worked on his memoirs, and he also helped with the construction of his personal presidential library, which was called the Harry S. Truman Library, opened in 1957 in Independence. His memoirs were very popular. Here they are, right here. These are his memoirs. Memoirs of Harry S. Truman. Volume 1, Year of Decisions and Years of Trial and Hope. These are the memoirs he wrote. Very big sellers. Okay, they were good sellers. He made a little money off those memoirs. And these memoirs tie in with Martin Luther King Jr., which I'll tell you that story much later. But remember the memoirs of Harry Truman when we talk about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Okay?
When was his
57. 1957 is when his library opened up. And where are presidents lots of times buried? On the grounds at their library. That happens a lot. Okay? Well, on December 5th, 1972, that's 72, President Truman became ill, and he entered a local hospital with severe lung congestion. On December 5th, 1972, President Truman became ill and entered a local hospital with severe lung congestion. Because of the complications with his lungs, he died 3 weeks later on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. So on December 5th, 1972, President Truman became ill and entered a local hospital with severe lung congestion. As a result of the complications he had with his lungs, he died 3 weeks later on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. He is now presently buried with his wife at his side at the Harry Truman Library in Independence. Now, Harry Truman, you ever heard the term, the buck stops here? You ever heard that term? He actually is the one that coined that. And he had a thing on it, he had a thing on his desk, well, not a thing, it looked just like this. This is an exact replica. This is what he had on his desk at the White House. The buck stops here. And he really believed that he wasn't one that was going to pass the buck. He wasn't going to say, oh, gee whiz, go talk to Mr. Sanford because of the cell phone policy. It's nothing I support, but boy, go talk to Mr. Sanford. That would be passing the buck. What he meant, the buck stops here. Hey, you're going to put your cell phones in there because that's what Mr. Sanford ordered. He's the principal here. We're going to do what he says. So he had this on his desk. Then if he wanted to, he could always turn it over, and on this side it said, the buck stops here, I'm from Missouri. That was what he did. This is very famous, though. This was on his desk his entire presidency, and he was known as a very much a no-nonsense type of fellow at all. Okay? Any questions on the profile? Okay, now what we generally do when a president takes over for another, or a vice president takes over for a president, we try to tell you what they did during the remainder of that president's term. So we're going to talk about legislation that was passed by Harry Truman during the Roosevelt term. Okay? Now remember, Roosevelt died pretty early, didn't he? In that fourth term. And so Harry Truman had a lot of presidency in him before he's elected to his own term. So he had some time to pass some legislation during the Roosevelt term. And I think some of these you'll hear of. I'm going to tell you about 4 important pieces of legislation that were passed during the time that Harry Truman served the remainder of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. And the first one was the GI Bill of Rights. Okay, the GI Bill of Rights. And you've heard a part of this, I'm sure. Now basically what the GI Bill of Rights did is it provided benefits for veterans of foreign wars. Okay? Veterans of foreign wars received some benefits, and I'm going to tell you what those benefits are. So prior to this, the GIs did not have a, quote, Bill of Rights. GIs didn't have a lot of benefits when they came back from fighting. Harry Truman's the man that put this into place that would help veterans after wartime. Okay? First of all, what do you think these veterans are going to want when they get back? Well, they're going to want a job, okay? And I know that, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. What else would a person want? What? They want a house. So what the GI Bill of Rights did is it provided low-interest government loans for veterans so they could pay for a house. It still is today. And there's some, we can kind of expand, I'll explain to you, but they could go borrow money at a low rate to buy a house. Now, what you want to do in your life, if you can find one, if you can find a house that's older, it may have a VA assumable loan. Now, if you're a veteran and you got this house at 2% interest back then, over a 30-year period of time, and you decided that you wanted to get a better house, you could have someone assume your loan and they would get what? 2% interest. So it was a good selling point. In other words, find a house that say, Lauren, listen, I'll say this house of mine that's got a VA loan on it, and I owe $130,000 on it, so if you give me $30,000, I will let you assume my loan, and you can take care of the loan. Now he might have not had that much into it, you know what I mean? And that was a real benefit for people to sell their homes as well. So it not only helped the veteran in buying a home, it helped the veteran in selling his home down the line as well. Okay, those that didn't go get a job in a factory might want to start their own business, or maybe they were farmers or wanted to be farmers when they got back. The second part of the GI Bill of Rights is it gave low-interest government loans for veterans so they could either start a business or they could start a farm, either one. So it was low-interest loans if you wanted to start a business or a farm. Could you probably have somebody assume that as well if you wanted to sell out? Sure you could. So that was another benefit, okay? Government loans to veterans to purchase a business or farm. Now, what do veterans not have? We're not talking about jobs. Now, what don't they have when they come back? Some teachers stay in education only because of this. When they should retire, they stay in there because they can't afford their own. And there you go, both. So what it did is it provided both pensions and hospital care for veterans. It provided pensions and hospital care. GIs didn't have a pension prior to this, a retirement. Now if you retire from the military, you're going to get a military pension based on factors for the rest of your life. Didn't have them before that. GI Bill of Rights started that. Okay? Hospital care. We have a VA. My father-in-law's 90. Served in the latter stages of World War II. He doesn't go to Dr. Thurston if he can go to the VA clinic for free for bigger problems. So they have VA hospital clinics and stuff to take care of veterans and charge them little or nothing to go for that care. Who's paying those doctors at the VA?
Our taxes.
Our taxes, that's right. Okay. Third, last thing it did, and you probably heard of this too, is if a veteran came back, and this sounds crazy to you, but if they left before they graduated from high school, or had a chance to go to college, or maybe were in college when they left, it provided government money for veterans to either attend their high school again and get their diploma, or to go to college. The GI Bill is a big thing. A lot of kids do this. If you go and you go to Montana State University and you join the Army ROTC there, or whatever, okay, they're going to help pay for your school. Or if you come back from Afghanistan and you've served our country, the GI Bill will help pay for your college. They even have things now. I talked to the recruiter, the Army recruiter the other day, who said that they're now providing college money up front for kids while they're in the Army. In other words, they can take online courses while they're in the Army, and then we'll provide them the opportunity to go to college when they're done. And that was probably the thing we hear of more now, is the GI Bill of Rights providing educational opportunities for veterans. Okay? So that was the first of 4 laws that Truman passed during the time he served Eisenhower's presidency. The next one was called the National Security Act of 1947. National Security Act of 1947. And all it did is it revamped what we know today as the Department of Defense. Because it wasn't called the Department of Defense from the time Washington took over the presidency to 1947. What was it called? Department of War. So in 1947, they passed the National Security Act of 1947, which created what we know today as the Department of Defense. no longer called the Department of War. That sounded too warlike, evidently, right? So Department of Defense. Now, this is the first time we ever had a Secretary of Defense. So the National Security Act of 1947 also appointed a Secretary of Defense within the President's cabinet. We didn't have one of those before, okay? So that became an official cabinet position, the Secretary of Defense. And then it also appointed 3 assistants to the Secretary of Defense. 3 assistants to the Secretary of Defense. Secretary of the, come on with me here, what? Army, Navy, and Air Force. Okay? So the National Security Act of 1947 created the Department of Defense. It appointed a Secretary of Defense within the President's cabinet, and it appointed 3 assistants to the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of the Air Force. Okay? Now, here's the big one. The third thing that was passed during the term of Franklin Roosevelt by Harry Truman, the 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution. 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution. Anybody know in this room what that stated? You haven't got to that in government yet?
No.
Thinking about what we've talked about, what do you think it might state? No? No?
The term.
If the 22nd Amendment of the United States Constitution limited the length of service as President of the United States to 2 elected terms. 2 elected terms. Not 2 terms, 2 elected terms. So if a vice president would take over for a president that was injured, killed, whatever, they could still be elected to 2 terms. So they actually could serve more than 8 years. You see what I mean? If they weren't elected. So the 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution limited the length of service of president to 2 elected terms. Okay? 4th piece of legislation passed of significance was the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Now this act simply did this. Put this in your mind. It tried to reduce the power of organized labor. Tried to reduce the power of organized labor. What is another thing for organized labor? Labor unions. Okay? Labor unions. Remember in our movie on the 1940s, what was going on at this time in a lot of these factories? What were they doing? Striking. These labor unions were striking. And Truman didn't like that. He thought they should go to work. Wyoming is a right-to-work state. That's why the WEA, the Wyoming Education Association, is wimpo-dimpo compared to the MEA, Montana Education Association. Teachers, the way teachers are treated in Wyoming by board, central administration, etc., would never be tolerated in Montana, because Montana has a very strict and strong labor union. Wyoming state law says this is a right-to-work state. So if you don't go to work, they're going to fire you. And that's kind of what Truman was trying to do by the Taft-Hartley Act, was reduce the power of organized labor. Now, he did it by doing these 3 things. This is great, and you'll understand this. First thing he did is he restricted the amount of money that a labor union could contribute to what? What? Political campaigns. Because, hey, I'll give you $1 million if you take care of the auto workers union when you're elected. He saw that as corruption. So what he did is he limited, this act limited the amount of money that a labor union could contribute to a political campaign. Second thing he did is he allowed employers injunctions against striking employees. He allowed employers injunctions, which is on your sheet, against striking employees. Now, it's just like, we're going to talk a little bit about the National Football League and this stand-in for the national anthem here in a minute. But in a contract it says you'll go to work. If you go on strike, you are violating that contract. And what an injunction is, it's a judicial order that says you cannot violate this signed contract. I signed a contract to be the teacher and guidance counselor at Orland High School. If I don't like the way they treat me and I go on strike, they're going to give me an injunction that says, hey, you signed right here on the dotted line that said that you would come to work here. You better get your butt to work or we're going to fire you. That's the second thing he did. And the third thing he did, which doesn't make sense to you maybe at this point, is all employees and all union leaders had to sign non-communist oaths, saying they were not communists or were not in support of communism while living into the United States. Okay, they had to sign non-communist oaths, they being all employees and all union leaders. Okay? He did a pretty good job. That helped. Tomorrow we're going to talk about a very unusual election, the election of 1948, and then show you a video on that. But I want to spur some discussion here, and I'm going to preface this by saying that when I say here today concerning this American flag business, that anything you might throw back at me is going to be your opinion and mine. Okay? I am not trying to influence you or tell you that I'm right.